Hello and thanks for joining us at interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibshirani and today I'm joined by Finance Minister Grant Robertson. Thanks for your time, Minister.
No worries.
Look, talking about tax, the marginal effective, I'm going to jump straight in here, the marginal effective tax rate on real returns from savings put in the bank or invested in shares is around 50%. But the rate on rental property is 30% and owner-occupied housing 10%. This clearly isn't fair. But the only additional measure that the government is thinking about introducing to address this is a tax on land bankers. How much more fairness would that bring to the system?
Well, that's exactly what we've got to investigate. What we know is that the land banking issue is partly fairness, but also partly to do with the housing market. And I think one of the interesting things about the Tax Working Group's report was that they did come back and say, yes, a CGT would support fairness within the tax system, but its impact on the housing market may not be as big as some people have thought. Now, that's a debatable point. But the focus on land banking is really about how do we make sure that we do use land that's zoned residential, that is available to support housing. It also has a fairness element to it, but it's not the be-all and end-all of that question. So the Productivity Commission is being asked to look at that from a local government perspective. They're doing their inquiry, and we know when we look around the world at the jurisdictions who do look at land banking that it tends to have a local government flavour to it for kind of obvious reasons. But we are also asking IRD to take a look at that issue as well. So it's a bit of both, but it's as much a housing issue as a fairness one.
Okay, and when we look at housing, that's obviously one of the big things the government committed to addressing, and the demand side drivers that, changes that are being made on the demand side. We have the ring fencing of rental losses, ban of foreign buyers, extension of the bright line test, and tax was meant to be the other big thing. But, what do you say to voters who are thinking the government just hasn't sort of done enough on the demand side?
Yeah, look, I think we're starting to see some impact on the demand side. I mean, the latest numbers are showing that the foreign buyer ban is having an impact. Obviously, the bright line test extension takes some time to have some impact because we have to go through the period up to the 5 years. So I think those two initiatives in particular are going to be important, the ring fencing as well. Clearly, I have held the belief that the CGT would have made a contribution in that regard, but we weren't able to get that over the line. In terms of what the Labour Party now does, we now need to go back and think about, well, what will our 2020 policy be? It won't contain a CGT, but there are other measures that will add to the overall fairness of the tax system that we can consider.
Could it include an extension of the bright line test beyond 5 years?
I think that's unlikely. I think we've probably done what we said we would do with bright line. I think most New Zealanders would accept that actually that is a form of capital gains taxation, and so I think it would be unlikely that would be extended further.
Why?
Well, because of that exact point, that we've taken capital gains tax off the table, and the bright line test represents a form of that. So
New Zealand First wouldn't agree to an extension of the bright line test. It's a slightly more palatable way of saying capital gains tax. We certainly went through a range of options with our coalition partner. I'm not going to go into the negotiations between political parties because there's a certain level of integrity and confidentiality that has to go on, but we explored a wide range of options and weren't able to get consensus on any of them. Okay, if you could have it your way and have a capital gains tax, what would that tax be on? Well, that's a moot point now, but the thing I've always focused on was that in order to get balance and fairness in the tax system, you needed to look at a capital gains tax that would be relatively comprehensive. What I'm saying is that after 3 elections of having a go at that, in 2011, 2014 and 2017, and now with the Tax Working Group, we haven't been able to get agreement. The thing I would add to that is to say that a lot of people have been saying, well, you can dilute it down and still get it. That's true, and look, we looked at a range of options, but equally, you do reach a point where you have to look at the cost benefit of, a diluted version versus what you get from it. The bottom line, however, is
it's off the table.
Okay,
so
if you
what I think about it is a moot point.
Yeah,
now.
but I'm just interested, if you could have it your way, would you have it across shares, small business, farms, investment property?
Look, I hadn't formed a final view on that. I was
you must have one.
Well, I've got a view on the fact that a form of capital gains tax would make a contribution. But remember, the tax working group proposed a package, and that package had offsets.
Yes.
And if it were ever going to apply to any of the things you mentioned, it clearly would have had things that offset that. But in the end, that is now a completely moot point because it's off the table.
Okay, look, coming back to the taxing of land bankers, that Productivity Commission report into local government financing, they're only going to report back to the government in November, so from which time the government will have the information and then it'll start looking at it. You know, is that kind of leaving this issue too late? I sort of feel like the government politically needs to get some runs on the scoreboard. Is that kind of dragging this out?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that is the timeline of the Productivity Commission's report. Bear in mind that had we gone ahead with a capital gains tax, it wasn't due to come into force until April 2021. So, you know, the work that we're now going to be having IRD and others do, we'll be able to take a good look at and make decisions on in next year. Okay.
Look, the other thing that you've said is you'll seek a review of the current rules of taxing land speculators. What do you mean by that? Can you expand on what you'd look at there?
So there are current rules in place around how people manage and deal with land. What we want to do is make sure that those rules are enforced properly, and are there any options available when we look around the world that we could look at people who are genuine speculators. And obviously the Bright Line test looks at that in terms of property. We need to make sure that our land rules back that up.
Okay, so what sorts of additional rules would you look at?
That's too early to say.
Well, you must have an idea because you've said it.
No, we've said that it's an area where we think there's room to move. We look at other jurisdictions around the world and we can see that there are different rules in place, but it's too early for me to speculate on what exactly those changes would be. Okay.
Minister, income tax thresholds, this is something that the tax working group said they thought that if you drop that bottom threshold for income tax, which is at $14,000, increase that bottom threshold, that would reduce inequality. And of course, as you said before, the reason that they talked about this is because they said, well, if you're going to introduce capital gains tax, you've got to offset it somewhere. Income tax is a place to do it. But the government has said, no, we're not going to look at those thresholds now because we don't have a capital gains tax. Do you not still see some merit in re-looking at those thresholds, given they haven't been changed since 2010?
It was interesting. What the working group actually said was that the welfare system was the best way of directly addressing inequality issues. So that actually was their first port of call. They then said, if you are going to try and offset a capital gains tax, here's how you would be able to best distribute it. Now that we don't have the income from a capital gains tax, that's not something the current government is looking at. In terms of the Labor Party and our tax policy for 2020, we're now in the process of writing that, and that's not finished, that's not completed, so we'll take a look at tax rates as we always do when we're setting that policy, but we're not in a position to be able to finalise that.
Okay. Look, the tax working group also said that if you're going to change these thresholds and you want to be really effective, you should also increase the top personal marginal rate. But it said that that was beyond the scope of its terms of reference. You know, that just kind of got me wondering whether the terms of reference was too narrow and also given it excluded the family home from a capital gains tax. So do you think there's an argument that regardless of what the group said, the outcome was always going to be half-baked with those tight parameters?
From a tax purist's point of view, of course they would want to consider the family home within a capital gains regime. We've seen that before from previous tax working groups. We wanted to set the tax working group a realistic mandate. We were not prepared to consider a capital gains tax on the family home, and we've been clear about that for 3 elections. We also campaigned on not increasing the top rate. So there was no point in having the working group consider things that simply were not going to happen. In terms of the Labor Party's 2020 tax policy, that's now what we're sitting down to debate, and I'm not in a position to be able to say anything more about that today, other than we will continue to look for ways of making our tax system fairer.
Okay. Environmental taxes, that was another part of the group's report. The government has said it won't be advancing new environmental tax proposals beyond the current work program. It's ruled out resource rentals for water and the introduction of input-based instruments such as fertiliser tax in this parliamentary term. Why have you ruled out those things?
Largely because that was the coalition agreement we made with New Zealand First, and I think everybody will remember the 2017 election campaign around water and taxation of water. We have a work program underway that David Parker is leading in the water space, where we're hopeful that we can come up with some good and positive policy proposals that will work its way through the system, just as the work in other areas that the tax working group proposed. So clearly they talked about the ETS, and we're right in the middle of that now in terms of the work of the Interim Climate Change Commission and the Zero Carbon Act that will come through. They made suggestions about the waste levy, and a report on that will be coming back to ministers very, very soon as well. In Auckland, there's an existing piece of work around congestion charging. That was ongoing as well. So we felt like in most of the areas the working group came forward on environmental taxation, we were already there. There are some areas that are off the table as a result of the coalition agreement. The other bit of that I think was useful was actually the work that the tax working group did on a framework for how you decide what you should use environmental taxation for. And I thought that was a useful input, because I think most New Zealanders would understand that tax is a potential part of how you manage environmental issues. And so that's given us a useful framework that we can use both in the consideration of those issues that we're working on now, but also whatever we might do in the future.
Okay. Look, the tax working group said that New Zealand was ranked 30th out of 33 OECD countries in terms of the amount of environmental tax revenue collected as a portion of the total tax take. So it seems like there's a lot of space in this area in terms of charging polluters through the various mechanisms you've
and that's right. I mean, there is some room to move there, and clearly the work we're doing on the emissions trading scheme is really important in that regard.
Okay. Look, infrastructure, thoughts on considering a New Zealand Super Fund suggestion to give investors that invest in qualifying New Zealand infrastructure projects, to give them some sort of tax breaks. How keen are you on that?
Well, we've clearly asked the Tax Inland Revenue Department rather to make that a priority piece of work for them. There is, I believe, some potential in that idea, and I know that that's shared across the government. We have a massive infrastructure deficit in New Zealand. We have a real need to get on with that. The government is putting more and more money into that. We are looking at different forms of financing mechanisms around that, the value capture proposals that you've heard Phil Twyford make earlier on. So yeah, look, it's an area that I think is worthy of a good thorough investigation. Okay,
Minister, the Labour Party particularly has been sort of slammed over the last 24 hours in regards to the power that Winston Peters and New Zealand First has in this government. It does make the government look a little bit shambolic that a party that has received proportionately small number of votes gets so much of a say. What do you say to that? Is this a shambolic government?
Absolutely not. This is a government that every day reaches consensus on a range of issues, which has allowed us to implement significant change. We rolled back tax cuts. We brought in the families package. We've got the fees free first year for tertiary education, for post school training. We've invested a lot of money. We do a lot of things. Every government under MMP has to negotiate. It has to work through issues. We don't always come to consensus on this issue. We haven't been able to be, but we're doing a huge amount every day, and I've got a budget coming up on the 30th of May, which I think is going to make a really big difference to the well-being of New Zealanders. That'll show that all the parties in this government can come together on important issues.
Okay, and speaking about that budget, we've talked about these demand-side drivers. We're just going to jump back to the start of the interview when we talked about housing, affordability, demand-side drivers. Supply side, there's the building of houses. That is, I think everyone can agree, is the crucial part, is getting that supply ramped up. You've been asked this a million times, but why does the government not borrow more and get some houses built?
Well, I think we're doing both of those things. We are borrowing more than the previous government had intended, and that's a deliberate decision. We are building more houses than previous governments have. We're actually building more houses than any government since the late 1970s. Of course, we want Kiwi Build to move faster, but there are other parts of the housing build program in terms of state housing, in terms of community housing, that we'll continue to push forward. But yes, housing, as you would expect, will be a big part of what we're trying to do in improving the well-being of New Zealanders.
Okay, the landscape's changed a little bit in terms of the Reserve Bank signalling that interest rates will be cut. It's really cheap for the government to borrow. It might still get cheaper. I talked to credit rating agencies only a few days ago in light of slight shifts in the economic environment, and they said there's ample room to borrow. And also the likes of Kiwi Bank's chief economist has said that monetary policy has kind of done its bit and fiscal policy needs to ramp up. What are your thoughts on that sort of sentiment?
Look, I absolutely understand that there are monetary and fiscal policy do have to work together. We have had an expansionary fiscal policy. We are investing more than the previous government. We obviously keep a very careful eye on the overall state of the economy, the overall state of the global economy, and the balance that we need to strike between being fiscally disciplined and making sure we play our part in stimulating the economy.
Not too much fiscal discipline?
That balance is the very thing that we've had in mind as we've produced our budget, and unfortunately you'll have to wait until the budget comes out, but we are very mindful of the fact that governments can act in a counter-cyclical way when the economy begins to slow. We have to balance that against other considerations, but we have been working on exactly that question.
Okay. Finance Minister Grant Robertson, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Janae.
Appreciate it. And I'm Janae Tipshirani from interest.co.nz.